in every garage and a chicken in every pot. While it may sometimes appear so, I was not actually there for the 1928 presidential election, during which Herbert Hoover, or advertisements on his behalf, used that as a slogan, prosperity throughout the land. Whether or not Hoover uttered the slogan himself, we all know that within a year, it was clear that not everyone was enjoying that kind of prosperity. In fact, for over a decade thereafter, the Great Depression made that slogan look like utter folly, fantasy, an empty campaign promise. In the ensuing years of suffering and sacrifice came along that group of boundless determination who would become known as the greatest generation. And any of us who go home today from church in a car to be nourished by something cooked in a pot owes a debt of gratitude to that generation. You may be thinking, Pastor Tim is just making up for the fact that he wasn't here on Veterans Day. But while I am grateful for having the time away last weekend and grateful to be back, I share that because those ideas came to me as I was reflecting on today's reading from Isaiah. Some translations subtitle what I read as the glorious new creation. And as is always the case with Scripture, context is essential for us to grasp what this passage is trying to communicate to us. One chapter short of the vast prophecy of Isaiah, this section comes at a time of anticipating healing and salvation, a return to the promised land after the devastation of exile. God's people had been forcibly removed from the land that God had promised and provided for them. That meant that they also were separated from their temple, the place where they experienced God to live and be present. Away from all of that, they were taken. For some of us, with life's ups and downs and ins and outs, even with that, we have gotten to largely determine where we would live, when we wanted to move. For some among us, that hasn't always been as smooth. Sometimes that has gone along with times that were less ideal, circumstances unsettling, maybe even traumatic. But wherever we are on that spectrum of experience, think about these words in the context of having been taken into exile and then anticipating coming back. Yet lest we draw on the 1932 presidential campaign and jump into singing "Happy Days Are Here Again," the return to exile did not automatically mean happy days were here again. The return from exile coincided with plenty of uncertainties and instabilities. While it might be tempting for us to think coming back to the promised land automatically meant everybody was mindful of justice and kindness and graciousness, the truth is that wasn't always the reality. It wasn't all unicorns and rainbows when they made it back to the promised land. Bitter divisions were prevalent in that society. Bearing the scars of exile, there was suspicion and resentment of any of the surrounding nations and cultures. greed and distortion of truth, even within the faith, decadence and corruption. This was all going on in the midst of God's people, the people whose whole identity was attached to being God's people and defined by how they worshiped and how they were mindful of the widow, the orphan, and the stranger, the foreigner among them. Isn't it a relief to know that Scripture is an ancient story about ancient people from an ancient time that is so foreign to our contemporary experience? In case you missed it, that was dramatic irony. What is it that they say in Ecclesiastes? There's nothing new under the sun. So into all of that, we find God speaking in Isaiah. Nothing is hidden from God. Nothing defeats God working for God's purpose. Mindful of that being vital and appreciating today's verses, we need to remember that it's precisely into that reality, into the very mess of life, that God speaks, that God comes, that God is working. Into the complications, uncertainties, drama, and trauma, God is at work to create new heavens and a new earth. Into the uncertainties, complications, drama, and trauma, God is creating something about which God's people are to rejoice. Into the complications, uncertainty, drama, and trauma, God is to create a beautiful city and delight in its people. Let's not gloss over that action verb. For the teachers among us and the grammar geeks, that action verb is to create. In the Hebrew Testament, only God creates. People can build and plant and produce and make, but only God creates. And all that follows in this passage from Isaiah is not intended to imply that God is going to start from scratch, start all over again and turn back the pages to Genesis. Rather, God promises to make all things new to the point that whatever went before would vanish from our memories. This text, like all scriptures, demands things of us. We may want to continue down into the rest of that passage from Isaiah and grab onto and hold on to all those good things that God promises. But if we do so, we can't lose sight of those beginning verses where God promises to create new heavens and a new earth. In order for us to have all that good stuff, sometimes we need to let go of what we know, what we're used to. And maybe some of you are like me and get a little anxious when things change. If sermons are to be our shared theological reflection, know that the messages that I share from this pulpit apply to me as much as they do to you in the pews. Will I really like new heavens and a new earth? Remember, this is the same guy who has the same wallet since 1980. And when the temperatures drop a little more, and I come wearing my overcoat, that is the same overcoat that I've had since 1988. But fear not, when we were hiking in the woods in Vermont last weekend, the jacket I was wearing was only from 1991. Even if you might not be as sentimental as I am, you get the point. Change, new things, however good they may be, can be sources of stress. Let's look at what God promises. No more weeping in God's city. Whoever's there, Jewish or Palestinian. No more infant mortality or lifespans curtailed. There'll be adequate health care for people to keep on living 2 to 3 times past what was at the time the lifespan average. There'll be sufficient housing and nutrition. Living based on the fear of another exile and plunder would be irrelevant. What the people produce will be accessible and enjoyed. Living long enough to see their products wear out. Hopefully not by 1981. Future generations will flourish in God's new world order, and natural enemies will peaceably coexist. If a politician were to make those statements, the pundits and the people alike would scoff at all of this folly, all of these unicorns and rainbows, utterly unrealistic fantasy. But the promise of new heavens and a new earth are not made by a politician or a pastor or prophet Isaiah himself or any of the people who followed Isaiah. These verses are all spoken in the first person. These are words of God that came to the prophet. For God is the only one capable of creating. The one capable of creating is the one who made all of those promises. If Isaiah had documented for us what amounts to God's "I have a dream" speech, what does this mean to us? What does it mean for us? In one of the commentaries that I read each week over at the office, the scholar Paul Hansen suggests God promises this renewal to restore all God's creation to its intended wholeness. God's not in denial that the world is a troubled place, then or now. But God is working in the midst of all of that, persistently committed to the redemptive process that was there from the beginning. And when we acknowledge to ourselves, to God, to each other, that we fall short of what God expects of us, we gain the opportunity and the responsibility to partner with God in God's redemptive work, pursuing God's purposes. That's how we, all these years later, participate in and enjoy the blessings of the resurrection. And isn't that the foundation of our faith? God has the purpose and the vision. God's the one who does the creating. Yet God doesn't leave us passively sitting on the sidelines to do nothing, just waiting for God to snap fingers and make it all happen. That would be unicorns and rainbows. Upon her passing, Eleanor Roosevelt was eulogized by Adlai Stevenson, who said she was a person who would rather light a candle than curse the darkness. In the midst of our world struggles, whether they be social or economic or political, into what darkness do we dare to light a candle? In what Pierre Teilhard de Chardin writes, in the divination of our activities, in the book called The Divine Milieu. He writes this: "Cleanse your intention, and the very least of your actions will be filled with God. Certainly the material side of your actions has no definitive value. Whether people discover one truth or one fact more or less, whether or not they make beautiful music or beautiful pictures, whether their organization of the world is more or less successful, all that has no direct importance for heaven. None of these discoveries will become one of the stones of which is built the New Jerusalem. But what will count? Up there, what will always endure is this, that you have acted in all things conformably to the will of God." God obviously has no need of the products of your busy activity, since God could give God's self everything without you. The only thing that concerns God, the only thing God desires intensely, is your faithful use of your freedom and the preference you accord God over the things around you. If we love God, he writes, something of our interactivity will never be lost. But will not the work in some sense be eternalized or saved? The more I examine myself, the more I discover this truth, that no one lifts his or her little finger to do the smallest task unless moved, however obscurely, by the conviction that he or she is contributing infinitesimally, or at least indirectly, to the building of something definitive, that is to say, to God's work. God knows intimately the challenges that we all face, and God invites us to trust. God knows the pains we have survived and the pains that we bear. And God anticipates new heavens and a new earth that will transcend all of that. God claims the role of the one who creates and welcomes us to participate in bringing God's dream, God's vision into reality. All of this, we know, is the one who answers us, as Isaiah writes, answers us before we have even asked, before we've even uttered the call. God initiates, God creates, and we respond. Be alert to where God is calling you, where God is calling us.